So I first of all want to acknowledge this is one of those rare opportunities where we get to talk and speak together. And so I'm grateful right from the get-go for the opportunity to share this in this presentation and a conversation more like with you. And I'd like to keep it open, and if you have a burning question I have no problem dealing with squirrels in life. In my professional world, that's what I solve problems and I chase squirrels. So I happen to be in the digital banking realm, so it is chasing squirrels and solving problems constantly. So what we'd like to do to talk about today.
This is Brenda Cornell, and I'm Jared Cornell.
And I go by Bree.
And just a little background on Brenda. She's the lady that organized basically with a lot of people, but really was a brainchild behind the wagon train in 1997 went from Council Bluffs to Salt Lake City. So Bree and I have literally spent thousands of miles on wagons, driving the trail, and so it's kind of in her background. And when we met, she told me about this crazy idea she had to put on a wagon train to cross 1,200 miles, and I was on board for it. We got married, and away we went.
And it was a surprise because most men I had been dating up until that point, it was usually a countdown, and they were gone. This one stuck around. And I'm grateful for it.
You probably fed it.
We did feed it, and had a great, incredible experience that isn't the topic for today. It's another time. But we'd like to talk about pick your poison in the 19th century. And what we could do, we were talking earlier that we could actually do this as a debate. I could do the botanical side, and he could do the mineral side, and we could have quite a bit of a debate going, a healthy debate, because there were different perspectives and different views and different contexts of the time. And I'd like to start this out with basically an acknowledgement that my studies with the Mormon Battalion, as far as medicine goes, started with these two books, and you're probably very familiar with them. I'll come back to the camera, sorry. And since that time, since reading Mr. Tyler's comments about Mr. Sanderson, and also hearing a little bit more about our author, or Miss Ricketts, Mr. Tyler, Miss Ricketts, they were authors doing their best at that time. But I will tell you that this has now been a journey. We've had a wonderful opportunity to actually view and see Dr. Sanderson's journals, what he actually wrote and documented. And it's like you kind of collect information along the way, and it's like, maybe he didn't hate the Mormons as bad as some people thought. But if you're a doctor trying to establish authority, and you have a group of rogue, mix-mash soldiers that have come to service, and they've been told by their leadership, watch out for those doctors. Only herbs. Don't do this and don't do that. And now you're the doctor in front of that group, trying to take care of them and trying to make sure that they make the trip, and you're trying to administer something that you as a doctor in the military have been trained is good for them, and they don't want to have anything to do with it. You might threaten to cut their throats. Now, I have threatened my developers. I have threatened several team members at times to get their attention. Not that I have any. Okay. Husband, you have experience with this? Okay, now can you hear? Do we have any feedback?
I'm sure she'll send some.
Okay. Yes, that was a thumbs up?
Not yet.
I'll keep my voice up, okay? So in my professional life, I have threatened my team members at times to get their attention and to establish my authority. And so if I'm a doctor trying to administer my medicine in the rusty old spoon, which got a really lot of mileage out of it, this spoon is basically, this is period, the time it's been polished up a little bit, but it can rust really well. And So I can understand the perspective of how people picked up these different pieces of information. So what we'd like to do is now continue in this conversation about how medicine came about in the early 19th century, what was happening in other aspects. If you turn the clock back and jump over to Europe in the early 1830s, and that period of time, even going back a little bit earlier than that, this is the time when Clara Barton, this is a time when she's starting to get her feet underneath her. This is also during the Crimean War. The Crimean War was a brutal time, and it was nurses who came in to the Crimean War and actually gave good food, warm food, cleaned the hospitals up, and all of a sudden their mortality rates changed dramatically. They didn't know why. These women were coming into a military situation, not knowing exactly, they were just doing what was common sense for them. Cleanness, warm food, wholesome food, and these other human beings responded. Then you start to see another scenario starting to evolve. And you have a doctor who is starting to do some research. In Europe, they were better about it. They did research, they did practice, and they did then go back in. And there is a man by the name of Samuel Weiss. He is a man that I think needs to be spoken about much more widely and broadly. He was doing some studies, and he realized, in particular in our COVID environment today, they had a problem in that he would go in and they were doing studies on people who had passed. In Europe, they could actually do some autopsies and work on the cadavers to see about what had happened to this person. But they were leaving that part of the hospital and going to the patient area and not washing their hands. Not washing. And they were wondering why they had what they called hospital sickness with these women who had just had babies. And then you started to see, So he started kind of putting pieces together, and he then asked, let's do an experiment. Before we leave this part of the hospital, we're going to wash and sanitize ourselves. Then we're going to go take care of our patients, and all of a sudden this hospital sickness almost dispersed. Now, he then wrote up some papers at the time, which was equivalent, presented it to his fellow doctors there in the European environment, which was probably about 3 or 4 countries at the time that were all kind of collecting notes. And he was laughed out of that audience. They made fun of him, they ridiculed him, and Samuel Weiss would pass away several years later on the street, penniless, and he'd come this close. In the meantime, the hospital went back to their old ways, and the hospital sickness came back. They never connected that again. Then you have the Crimean War. They're saying, cleanliness is really something important. But really, we women were just fussy about having our clean white linens before we took our patients. Our midwives were just fussy. And yet, the experience, it took over a period of time to realize there is a connection and there's a relative relationship to these parts and pieces. We as human beings had to learn along the way. So, anyway, with Samuelson, we've learned that maybe, and I will just put it out to this group, maybe Mr. Samuelson wasn't as evil. Maybe he did not hate the Mormons as much as he has been portrayed to do. This week in the church history, or the church news, there was an author who put out an article earlier in the week, and I really appreciated his comments. And I'd like for us to think about it for a minute. In this year where we're celebrating these milestones, the 150th, you're now the 175 Yes, we came into the valley 25 years ago in a large event. And so there are milestones. And so much of the time with history, as time goes on, we have a tendency to change that story just a little bit, for whatever reason. But in the church news this week, there was one of the authors from the history department. Let's tell the truth about history. Let's tell the full truth. And so that's what we'd like to explore here today as we continue with that. Are we game? Are you all right? Have I offended anybody by saying, you know, maybe Ricketts and Tyler had part of it, part of the truth. I also witnessed something this week that was still resonating in my mind, that while one individual may think their attire is appropriate, period, authentic, even to the point of it being sacred to that individual, another individual looking at it and experiencing it may think it be lewd and be offended. And I saw the two exchange. Sadly enough, the one individual who was wearing that attire that he believes is sacred has been a part of the Sundance, as in Native American, left the event. And the other individual who had reported it out in our social media world, thinking it was lewd, offensive, we'll never know the impact. This helicopter mom, that's what I'm going to call her, this helicopter mom trying to take care of her kids, and I understand where she's coming from, she will never know the impact of that post on another human being. And so again, through the journey of medicine, it is a journey of what happens here, the receiving end for another human being. Sometimes it's good, but it's a journey. And it's not always, we haven't arrived yet. We haven't arrived. So I look back and I think, okay, let's take the clock back and just look briefly at why did the Mormons believe that folk medicine and even botanic was so vitally important? And you go back to a young boy, the prophet Joseph Smith, and typhus impacts his family, nearly kills his sister, and then impacts him by he contracting the infection in his leg, what ends up being what we call osteomyelitis. And I have seen bones that are preserved as a part of displays, and when osteomyelitis attacks a bone, it becomes very open and very porous, and it has to be one of the most, I can't understand how painful that would be. But a young boy, the prophet, at a young age, is impacted with osteomyelitis. And the surgery, the surgical process, we have one of the saws, not the saw, but we have an original saw of the period, the Hayes saw, that was used with nothing as a barrier to that pain. I come away with a whole appreciation for Lucy Maximoff. That she would be in the other room, knowing and understanding the pain. The father, yes, he stayed, but that pain in a young man's age would have impact on what is a good thing and what's a bad thing. And yes, Lucy went to a doctor. She went for a resource to try to save her son, because it obviously would have, the first doctors wanted to take the leg. Can you imagine? It wouldn't have worked to have a prophet as an amputee. He needed to stand with strong stature. He needed to be able to walk and to move and for people to respect him. And amputees of the period, not so much. So an amputation of a leg in a young boy's life would have changed the direction. And thank heavens, they were able to save the leg. But that must have impacted his view on medicine and taking on, have you any natural remedies? So when you have somebody like then watching this evolve and now getting to Nauvoo, and he understands Joseph's strong counsel to use the herbs, to use the botanics, that's what they lean towards. We start to see something like what Samuel Thompson, he creates a guide to health. And this guide to health was published in 1846. And this guide to health basically outlined botanics. Yes, this is a copy of a print that we got a hold of. But he uses some things that we would not, the various theories of ancient and modern practice. Now, he would go to people and he would sell them a guide to health. And one of the counsels that Joseph had given, as well as Brigham Young, he counseled with the priesthood, with the botanics, and all of these different elements. You can be your own medical. And very strong counsel. Well, Samuel Thompson had the solution for them. And he would present this book saying, hey, with this materia medica and these instructions and actual recipes that we'll go into it here in a minute, but with this materia medica, you have a guide to health to take care of your family. And then what he would do, he'd put them under a promise. He says, you can buy this book and have it on your hearth for your use. It's going to cost you just about a year's wage. And then I'm going to put you under a promise. You can't share it with anyone. So he could continue to sell books. Quite the businessman of the period. But again, I just share with you he has an injection powder. And this was used basically to help in pain. But it was take of bayberry, and it actually gives the ounces, cayenne, lobelia herb. Now, lobelia is a plant that we use for flowers around our garden areas. Lobelia was his main ingredient in all of his medicine. Slippery elm, which we know was probably the main ingredient to help in the pain, and valerian. Mix this together, pulverize it, well mixed, 2 teaspoons in a gill of hot water, given about warm blood. Now, all the way through this, it shows adhesives, tinctures, essence, ointments, and lobelia is prevalent everywhere. As we do more research and check into what lobelia does, it stimulates the system, stimulates the liver, but it also has some other side effects. And so, yes, it helped for a period of time, but lobelia over too much can be a poison. But the Thompsonian medicine was embraced by the Mormon faith in Nauvoo, heavily embraced. And then as the battalion was leaving, Brigham wrote to the battalion members, if you are sick, live by faith. Let surgeon's medicine alone. If you want to live, use only herbs, and mild food are at your disposal. If you give heed to this counsel, you will prosper. But if not, we cannot be responsible for the consequences. Now, this is in the mindset of these Mormon Battalion boys. Yes? Absolutely. Absolutely. This is the actual quote. And I know that later on they do talk about the use of the priesthood. And I will... Not a problem. The question was, are they relying on the priesthood as well? Yes, they were counseled to leverage and use their faith in the Lord, to use the prayer, and to use the priesthood in their health regimen as well. This was basically a letter that was written directly. So then can you imagine now these young men meet up with Dr. Sanderson, who's now trying to administer something called calomel. And calomel is not calamine, it's calomel. And Jared will talk a little bit more about what that component is. So you've got valerian on one side as a poison that ends up being a poison. You've got calomel on another, and the battalion, the U.S. medical facility meet, and it's not really a good experience. And they do not come away with an agreement. They agree to disagree. But in the meantime, there are things written that a growing evil is in the midst. And it was an adversarial time period. So the thing that's interesting as time goes on, you see Brigham Young coming into the valley. He was very adamant that he did not want doctors. Now, he's of a younger age at this period of time, and they created a medical group, they exchanged, they were given counsel. Look to the island in the middle of the Salt Lake as a point of source for medicine. Because of the saline, the saltine, they could grow and they could collect things. They were also counseled to go to the Native Americans and find out what other plants. And it's interesting to go into the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers and see some of those collections along the way. They were very careful not to share or document very well what it was that made up that component. They guarded it very carefully. Brigham Young then, later on, he sent a nephew to be trained as a physician as he grew older. And he also sent 5 women. One was Ellis Reynolds Shipp. Shipped 5 women. Miss Shipp was born in 1847. She was born when they came into the valley. She later is sent back east to Philadelphia to become a trained doctor. And she then comes back with 5 other women trained in the medical field. She helps birth 5,000 babies. She creates a school of nursing and obstetrics and establishes in the late 1880s the Deseret Hospital. But Brigham is actually starting to evolve and change a little bit in his views of medicine. Later on in life, actually coming in as a doctor, they were encouraging a little more science, not as much botanic. Balance it between. So they start from one side and they go to the other. But to your point, sir, about the priesthood, Ellis Reynolds Shipp was known to be a woman who, men and women of faith in the medical field, and she was adamant about that. I admire the woman a great deal for what she was able to do. She was a pioneer in her time frame. A woman as a doctor in 1880s. Wow. That was a milestone. No, she wasn't. She was actually probably about 2 or 3 years old when the battalion. Yeah. So, no, she wasn't. But Brigham had given the counsel about, stay away from, and yet even later on in life, he actually passed by ruptured appendix. I don't know if you're aware of that. And a ruptured appendix, I know personally, has got to be one of the most painful experiences. And in his last hours, they gave him morphine. He requested some pain relief, and it was morphine they administered. So he came, absolutely. And so even Brigham evolved in his view of botanic versus mineral science versus bringing in the doctors and getting a balance along the way. So it was a journey for them as well. So I'd like to transition this to Jared and let him talk a little bit about the U.S. military view.
Yeah, where's our view of medicine come from? What do we know about the human body? Where do we know how things work? When did that happen? It's a very long evolved thing. Medical history, I don't want to get into a big, long, evolved lecture here on medical history, but you go back, your average doctor in the 19th century, their knowledge of anatomy comes primarily from a doctor named Galen. who was a Roman physician that was treating gladiators. And in the Roman Empire, you were forbidden to do dissection. You could not, it was a violation of somebody's body to do that. So Galen, working on gladiators, had this opportunity to witness some of these really savage wounds, and he could actually, literally at times, look inside someone and see where the organs were and how they're arranged. Now, you could dissect animals, and you'll see sometimes pictures of frogs dissected and people thinking that's what a human being looked like inside. And there's not really too much basis that people actually believe that wholeheartedly, but Galen had put together an idea of what the anatomy was like and what things work like now, and kind of put this in a code, and people use that for 1,500 years. Galen was the authority in the world on what the human body was and how disease worked. What makes you sick? Galen had different ideas. They had a culture where they talked about humors in the body. You've probably heard about the 4 humors. And it's really based on a breakdown of how the blood breaks down and goes different colors and segments into different things. And they thought that's what these humors in your body had to be in balance for you to be in health. Now today, can a person have heart disease? Yes? No? Now in this time period, going into the early 1800s, a person didn't have heart disease. You had a diseased body, and the diseased body caused the heart to be diseased. And so they felt that if you bring the body back into balance, it's not the heart that's causing the body to be out of balance. The body being out of balance is causing the heart to have problems. And so they felt that by bleeding was one of the techniques that a physician would utilize at this time period, that the bleeding would bring the humors back into a sense of balance, and if you put the body in a sense of health, every organ within the body will be in a sense of health. And understanding what organ did what was absolutely not really widely understood. The biggest, most important organ inside your body is what? What's the biggest organ you have inside your body?
Oh, inside your body?
Yeah.
Is your liver.
Yeah. The biggest organ you have is your skin. So that's why I say inside your body is the liver. Henceforth, the liver is the most important organ in your body, correct? This was the view. Where does your blood supply come from in your body? Well, at this time period, the blood supply in your body comes from the liver. The veins come from your liver. When they dissect somebody, and finally did that, they saw there's a lot of vein, a lot of things in there. They thought the liver is your source of blood in the body. Therefore, if you're having any kind of problems, you need to bring the liver, you need to stimulate that liver in order to make your overall health better. And you do this by bleeding. You do it by giving certain medicines to it, mineral medicines, and it stimulates the liver, the production of bile, and it just makes your health better, and everything in your body is better as a result of that. It's kind of like looking at a cold a little bit. A cold, one of the symptoms of a cold is a what? A runny nose. Does the runny nose cause the cold, or the cold cause the runny nose? It's kind of the chicken and the egg thing. And in this time period, they thought that the excess of phlegm caused the cold, not the cold caused an excess of phlegm. So many ways they were just thinking backwards on things. They put a lot of thought into it, but it was just really not well. They just didn't have the scientific basis to know how things actually worked in the body. So and then we come into like the Nauvoo era with the LDS faith, and there was a very, very, very strong bias against any mineral medicines. And part of that goes back, a big part, as Bree talked about with the Thompsonian medicine, but Joseph Smith's brother Alvin died, and as he's in that process, he's having a lot of pain, and they gave him, the doctors that came in gave him a substance called calomel, which is mercurous chloride. And when he did not get better and he died, they did an autopsy on him basically, and they found out that he had a big blockage down in his intestinal tract. And they blamed that on the fact he had been given calomel. So in the Smith family, calomel was one of the really, as a bad word. It was a bad medicine. It could cause death, which is true. It can. But it was not, in my study of it, it was really not what killed Alvin Smith, in my opinion. The calomel did not have time to have any effect like that. But that bias is there. That bias, of course, is then passed on to the members of the church. And so mineral medicine was just a no-no. Thompsonian medicine came out, and it's really, she said, pick your poison. The mineral medicine is a poison, but so is the lobelia that he's giving out in his medical system. They were both trying to accomplish the same thing, which is stimulate the liver. cause a production of blood, production of different things, and how they're going about it varied a little bit, but they wanted the same result. Now, neither one of them are actually based on anything of medical truth, but it was just the idea of the day. And so the Mormon Battalion comes into the service, and they get this advice that they are not to take mineral medicine. And the Army, of course, what is their course of treatment for everything? Mineral medicine. And so what's the result going to be? You're going to have this head bashing going on, and who's going to win? Well, when you're in the Army, you're under their discipline, you're under their authority, and like it or not, you kind of have to do what they do. I never had the flu in my life until I went in the Army, and before, back in the tail end of Vietnam, and I had to go through, and they'd line you up 300-400 deep, whatever, and you'd go through, and they'd give you these, just blow the vaccine into you with an air gun, literally. And if you paused too long, you got 2 shots. You just had this like a conveyor belt moving. I never had the flu in my life until the Army gave me a flu shot. And then I had the flu every year for the next 5 years until my system got back to my balance. But I had no choice in the matter. And the soldiers in the battalion had no choice in the matter. You got up in the morning, the first thing you did was a roll call, and then you'd report for sick duty. Not sick duty, but if you were sick, you had to report, and you'd be sent to the physician while the camp is being broken down. The Army's getting ready to get on the road and move out, and at that point, the soldiers would go to Dr. Sanderson. And Dr. Sanderson had to prescribe something or do something to treat these soldiers. Now, he had 4 choices, basically, in the Army medical thing. You had 4 basic drugs that you'd use as your frontline defense. The first one is alcohol. Alcohol is a stimulant. If a person's weak, tired, sick, whatever, give them some alcohol. You could do that. Opiates are your second choice. And so depending on what's going on, they could give them opiates. But the 2 that really are the twin pillars of the American medical field at this time are calomel and quinine. Calomel is, we actually, those of you that like to see the beast, we actually have a bottle of calomel here. Where's the one with the pills in it? That one? We had one that had the pills in it. This is a bottle of calomel. Now, Daniel Tyler, when he wrote his book 50 years after the fact, the Mormon Battalion, in his book, there were 3 people that Daniel Tyler just absolutely eviscerated. Now, of course, was Dr. Sanderson was one of the main villains. A.J. Smith was the other villain, and George Parker Dykes, the battalion adjutant. Now, I'm going to pass this little bottle around so you can kind of see we're talking about calomel. Just kind of pass that around and make sure it, of course, comes back. Don't take any, please. Don't want to be accused of poisoning anybody. But these 3 men in the battalion history are really, really, really vilified for whatever reason. Tyler had some problem with them. Of course, Sanderson was the big problem there, of course, was the medicine. You got 2 different conflicting ideas on what made a person healthy or not. Their advice was don't do it, the Army's making them. So there's that villain. A.J. Smith, of course, was pushing the battalion very hard. Almost all of the real conflict you see, all of the controversy, actually evolves around the health and well-being of the battalion. That was their biggest concern in the field. So when A.J. Smith is pushing the battalion and talks about separating the battalion and taking people off the sick call, things like that, you have another big conflict that comes up. And then you had a conflict where A.J. Smith is being told, the men are saying, we don't want to take this medicine, and they're telling Sanderson they won't take it. Sanderson's reporting back to A.J. Smith, his chain of command, these guys don't want to take the medicine I'm giving them. I've got to force it on them. I give it to them, they take it out, they dig a little hole, they bury it, they're not taking it. I have to make them take it with my rusty old spoon. I have to actually watch them take it. Otherwise, the Army is just wasting its medicine on these men that aren't taking it. And so A.J. Smith is going, well, why don't they want to take it? Sanderson's, well, they say it's a spiritual, doctrinal thing in the Scriptures. They can't take it. And Smith's going, well, okay, he could kind of honor that to a point. So he goes to the adjutant, George Parker Dykes, and George Parker Dykes is a lot like Bruce R. McConkie, in a way, as a scriptorian. He's the man you went to if you want to know what it says in the Scriptures. A.J. Smith goes to Dykes and says,
Where is it in the scriptures of the LDS faith that says you can't take medicine? What's Dyke's response? There isn't any. Okay, then they can't base this on religion. So Smith basically tells Sanderson, make him take the medicine. And this is where this big conflict comes from. Now calomel is a mercurous chloride. And this goes back to about 1600 is when they really started making what we know as calomel. Calomel was one of the most prescribed medications in America during this time period. Quinine and calomel are the two that are really promoted. Quinine sulfate, this medicine here, is something you take when you have a fever. Now what today, it's kind of been interesting the last 2 years to me watching people. I tell my students at school years ago, if you have a fever, how concerned are you? You get up in the morning, you have a fever, how concerned are you normally? Yeah, pre-COVID, that's my point. Yeah, pre-COVID, you get up in the morning, you have a fever, what do? You maybe pop an aspirin, an Advil, whatever, it's on your generation. And go to work, no big deal. Now, if you look back in 1846, 1847, you wake up in the morning, you have a fever. What's your attitude? I could die. People wake up now with a fever, they go, oh, maybe I have COVID, I better, you take all this. Similar to that, we're kind of going through that just a little bit today. Taking a fever was something that killed people. And it was the first indicator something's wrong with your body, and it was a big indicator. And today, there's a lot of things that can do it, maybe mild, maybe not. But they did not know if it was a mild or severe thing that was going to kill them. So the doctors, of course, would prescribe quinine as a fever reducer. Malarials, different diseases, yellow fever, mosquito-borne diseases. More people have been killed in human history by mosquitoes than about any other single cause. Today, how many people die of malaria? In the time it takes me to say this sentence, someone just died of malaria. In the time it takes me to say this sentence, someone just died of malaria. That's today. 2.5 to 3 million people worldwide die of malaria every year. Not a problem in the U.S., but in other parts of the world, it really is. Now, quinine is something that, it was a disease that, of course, comes out of Africa into Europe, different places. And it became a real problem, and a lot of people were dying of malaria. Malaria, there's of course, mosquito-borne. And in the Roman Empire and places where they were plagued with malaria, where did malaria come from? They thought that malaria was actually the cause of breathing bad air. And so they lived in areas that had swamps, decayed vegetable matter. This would be in the air. The miasmic theory, basically, that bad air is what causes the disease. And they were onto something there because those areas also, of course, harbored mosquitoes. But they thought that it was the bad air that caused it. But when they came over to the New World, and a Jesuit priest was messing around trying to see what the local people used for medicinal purposes, they found that there was the bark of a tree that would help reduce fevers. Quinine. It was developed out of that bark of that tree. They called it Jesuit bark, different things, and eventually this became the most prescribed thing. So if you went to Sanderson on the morning sick call, 2 things you'd be given, either quinine or calomel. Now quinine people had no problem with, but the calomel was the big one that the soldiers in the battalion really pushed back on. Now this particular bottle of calomel, pardon? Not really. Mercurals are antiseptic a little bit. Most medical authorities now, when you talk about calomel to them, they're kind of somewhat indifferent to it. The people that are really into it a little bit, they say, well, mercury's not really good for you, but the quantities they're giving and what they're doing here probably wasn't really doing any harm. Not calomel per se, okay? Can I make that point? Mercurous chloride. This is a thing that is not highly soluble in water. So when you take a calomel pill, and usually just a half a grain, a very mild dose of a mercurial, when you take it, the effect, what they want it to do is actually to purge your system, okay? The body doesn't like it, so it tries to get rid of it. That's the whole purpose of it. The way you cure disease is to bleed someone, you make them puke, or you purge them. Those are the three ways to bring body back into stasis, back into balance. Some of the Army doctors were bleeding at this time. And bleeding was still considered, I would say there were 95 doctors in the U.S. Army during the Mexican War. Those 95 doctors, I would say probably 40 of them were still bleeding. Dr. Sanderson was one of the more enlightened doctors that said bleeding's nonsensical. But he still did have the real faith on the calomel. And so he was giving this to him. Now, calomel, when you take it this way, as mercurous chloride passes through your system, it's not really, doesn't leave very much behind. 95% or more is passing through your system. Now, if you expose this to heat and moisture, then you have a chemical reaction that turns into mercuric chloride, which is highly, highly soluble in water. And then when you take that same dose, you're retaining about 95% of the mercury. And this is where calomel really gets its bad reputation. It's not the calomel itself properly given in doses here and there that really did any real damage, but when it was altered, that's when it became a real deadly poison. And that's the big problem at the time. And my study and reading about Sanderson, how he's giving the medicine, he was giving the medicine to them, and he gave them instructions to take it, mix it in with the tea, and drink it as a hot drink. So he was taking it from a pill form here into a liquid to take it. The way he was administering it was the proper way to put the medicine out there. So a bigger question is, was anybody in the battalion ever killed by calomel? My instinct is no. I would say Mr. Phelps was not from calomel. That's what he claimed, but how much had he taken and for how long? This is not something that you take it today and you die tomorrow. This is in mercury poisoning, it's more, it affects your nervous system, it affects things like that. That's not the symptoms they're talking about. Yeah, exactly. Okay, question? Yes, and that was really where you see with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and others being counseled to stay away from mineral medicines with that experience with Alvin Smith. But when you really look at, like we talked about earlier, the autopsy results of Alvin, it does not point to calomel poisoning. There's a really severe blockage in his intestinal tract that actually probably
in comparison with other military units at the time. And if you measured another military doctor over a group of men, what was the comparison of success? Sanderson brought how many? Yes, there was a sick detachment, but when you look at an average group of 500 men on a journey with another doctor versus Sanderson, what were the statistics?
3 men under Dr. Sanderson actually died under his immediate care. Three out of the 500. People were dying before Sanderson was even attached to the battalion. People in the sick detachment. The average unit going in Mexican War service, the average mortality rate from disease was 17%. So 17 out of 100 would be dying disease. So you take that, multiply that by 5, that's how many deaths would have been in the battalion had they just been average. Sanderson's statistics is more like 0.04%. Less than 0.5% of the men under Sanderson's care died. So if Dr. Sanderson was trying to murder the men in the Mormon Battalion, he was horrible about doing his job. One of the 3 men that died under Sanderson's care, it's like he came in, they brought him to Sanderson late in the morning, and he was dead like at 2 in the afternoon. Nothing Sanderson did. I don't know that Sanderson did any more, but just look at him and take him off. Where some of the other conflict came in with Sanderson, of course, was his refusal to let him ride in the wagons. Things like that. Now sometimes that's really not in the doctor's domain really. The wagons are dedicated to the hauling supplies, the logistical support of an Army unit in the field. And the sick, in the Mexican War, really there was not a good system of medicine in place to take care of men that were sick, particularly in the field. Now you take Fort Leavenworth, you're on sick call, you report to the doctor, you go to the hospital. They can take care of you, put you in a bed, take care of you that way. A unit in the field is a whole different animal. Where do you put the men that are sick? Are there hospitals? No. Are there ambulances? No. And the men, in a large measure, are just kind of have to take care of themselves. The wagons are not intended for the transport of the sick. Now, humanely, they should have, in my opinion. But then you get an Army unit stuck out in the middle of nowhere because you can't transport the food and the men, the ammunition and the men, the things you need as a unit. What's your mission as a commander of a unit? To get the unit there in shape to go into combat, or to take your sick men along with you? So the decision to even split the sick off was very, very controversial, because they were under instructions, again, from Brigham Young, not to be separated. And here the commanding officer telling them to separate. So most of the real conflict you see in the battalion goes back to health, well-being, and instructions from the church leadership and the Army telling them to do something different. And when you're in the Army, who do you obey? Where's your bottom line on that? You know, even in the Articles of Faith, it tells us to obey kings, queens, and magistrates. So does that apply to the Army? I don't know. So you got both sides of the spiritual question, I guess you could kick around.
So we're out of time. This is a conversation we love to continue, and just, it's a journey. And who knows, 2 years, 3 years from now, we may have new information. But it is interesting to see the perspectives of how one group of men came in with a firm belief. Their mindset had been set. They continued with that. And then you had the military come in with their training and background and didn't necessarily come with a meeting of minds. And years later, we're still discussing it. And I would love to do a time trip and go back and say, okay, can we actually witness and diagnose what was going on? Someday, maybe. But thank you very much.